Well, hello and welcome to Insight with Political Tours, the travel company led by reporters around the world. For the past 3 decades, the African National Congress has dominated South African politics. Since the fall of apartheid, it's been the only party in government. All that changed, though, this month in the historic election, which saw the ANC lose its majority. Now, Cyril Ramaphosa's government is in negotiations to form a new cabinet with bitter rivals. The question is, can it succeed? And will South Africa be able to address some of its fundamental problems, be it corruption, incompetence, failing services and disastrous infrastructure? We're joined by Dawie Boonzaaier, a journalist with the Afrikaans news outlet Rapport. Hello and welcome, Dawie.
Thank you, Nicholas.
Good to have you with us. We've also got Peter Sullivan, I see, popping in the background. Peter's our expert and leader on our tour, so I'm going to come to Peter a bit later to get some of his views. But first of all, Dawie, I think everyone knew that the ANC was in trouble. What was the campaign like?
Well, a very desperate ANC for long stretches of it, and I do think they fought for a long while. That in history, the ANC have always started very slowly during their campaigns, and then they have a huge uptick of massive door-to-door campaigns in the last month leading up to the election, and then usually they get it across the line. And I think they were going to do the exact same thing by launching massive door-to-door campaigns in KwaZulu-Natal and Gauteng, especially the two most populous provinces here in South Africa. But none of the support returned. None of the support that they usually would bank on getting in that last month came, and I think it's all comes down to their former leader Jacob Zuma and the former president of South Africa, his new party called Caucuses, which absolutely decimated the ANC support, especially in KwaZulu-Natal.
Wow, that's amazing. So in terms of the actual figures, can you compare if you were to add up the MK support and the ANC support, was that down on previous years if you put the two together?
Yes, well, if you add the MK support to the ANC's support this year, you will get the ANC would have still been up by 52%, I think, a 52% majority. But especially in KwaZulu-Natal, which is the second most populous province in South Africa, MK basically got like 45% of the votes in KwaZulu-Natal, wow. Whereas the ANC was still at 54% in the previous provincial election in 2019. So that is in a period of 5 years, the ANC fell from something like 54% to 17% in the province, which is traditionally their stronghold. Most ANC members live in KwaZulu-Natal. The most ANC branches reside in KwaZulu-Natal. So yes, the former president Jacob Zuma's party has completely decimated their support.
Okay, and of course, for those who don't know, Umkhonto Sizwe is the armed wing of the ANC. So he chose a sort of provocative title for the name of the party, and it seemed to come out of nowhere, didn't it? From nothing to a huge amount in a very short amount of time.
Yes, last year, I think in September, so the party was registered with the IEC, and the ANC didn't really pay any attention to it at all, because it was registered by an unknown man called Jabulani Khumalo. And then in the same month, I think the ANC started reaching out to former President Zuma, asking him if he would be prepared to campaign for them during the upcoming elections. And I know they did that because they thought that another party, also a breakaway ANC party called the Economic Freedom Fighters, the EFF, they were targeting the former president to campaign for them during the election, because there's been the former president really doesn't like the current president of the ANC, Mr. Cyril Ramaphosa, and we can get into that a bit later. So the ANC was still hopeful back then that Jacob Zuma would be campaigning for them during this upcoming election. And then suddenly in December last year, chapters started doing the rounds that, oh my goodness, no, Jacob Zuma is leaving the ANC. What are we going to do? We probably need to speak to the EFF about this. And then, no, he wasn't just leaving the ANC, he was joining his own new party, Umkhonto Sizwe, or the MK party as it's colloquially known. So out of nowhere, the ANC were really caught with their pants down on that, and they were campaigning against it on the back foot.
Yeah. So what were the final numbers? What was the actual percentage to give us the top 3-4 parties?
So the ANC got 40.1% in the election.
So that's shocking, really, isn't it?
It's 17 percentage points, which it fell from in 2019. So that's absolutely decimated. The DA grew with 1 percentage point. They're the official opposition. Well, not anymore. They might be now in government, the Democratic Alliance. They grew from, I think they were 20.8% to 21.9% now.
And just to say who they are, they've run the Western Cape. Helen
Yes.
Zille was formerly their head, seen as being predominantly white, although they would say they're multi-ethnic. But really it is true they are. Many of their MPs are white, and also much more to the right, much more market orientated in their politics.
Yes, a liberal party and much more to the right, and free market policies, in contrast to the other three parties we mentioned now, which are much more socialist. In third place was MK with 11%. So I think that's the best the new party has ever done in a democratic South Africa in their first election, and it's all based on that support they got in KwaZulu-Natal, basically. And then the EFF, the other party, was courting former President Zuma. They went down from 10.9%, I think, to 9.2 something percent.
And they, of course, the big fear has been of the spectre of the economic freedom fighters, as they're called, led by Julius Malema, who's a firebrand former member of the ANC youth wing, and he really does get the crowds out, doesn't he? And he's a very successful campaigner.
Very militant as well in his campaigning as well. I'm very Marxist and a far left party, and always treads the line, and he'll say, he's not a racist and that he's accepting of white people, but then he also sings songs like "Shoot the Boer," which in South Africa "Shoot the Farmer," i.e. white people. So yeah, a very far left party, and but yeah, also born out of the ANC. Malema was president of the youth wing for a long time, and I think it was also the current ANC president, Ramaphosa, who kicked him out of the party during a disciplinary committee.
Yeah, and I guess the real worry there was that if the ANC was losing, that the EFF might do very well, and you might get some kind of coalition between the ANC and the EFF. And Julius Malema's party is for reclaiming the land without compensation, so he's basically seizing white assets, going down the Zimbabwe model, which obviously would be destabilizing significantly. So the fact that the MK party came in and the EFF didn't do so well is actually quite a boon for the Democratic Alliance.
Yeah, the Democratic Alliance leader, John Steenhuisen, he started warning people about the possible ANC alliance. And the reason why I was warning people, he called it a doomsday coalition. And the reason why I was warning people against it because of the EFF's policies, which is nationalization in a country which, let's be frank, needs privatization to get its economy booming again. And then out of nowhere comes the MK, and then suddenly Steenhuisen had to adapt his messaging as well to include them as well into the doomsday coalition, because they're even a much more scarier prospect than the EFF in government, I think. They want to scrap the current constitution. They want to take us back into the dark ages with regards to gay people's rights in the country. They want to force people to do military service. They want to get these are stuff out of their actual policies. This is not just me spitballing. They want to force pregnant girls, teenage girls, to go live in Robben Island as some sort of way to just get them
like a 19th century workhouse. I mean,
it's terrible.
Bizarre. But so and the one other thing we should mention is that Steenhuisen accused the MK of being funded by Russia. And is there any? I mean, the funding of the parties has been a real question, hasn't it? So just tell us a bit about that, and then we'll get on to the question about the coalition talks.
Yes, so in South Africa, all parties need to declare all funding that they receive above 100,000 Rand. I think it's like $5,000, which they need to declare to our electoral commission, the IEC. And MK hasn't declared a thing. which is very funny because it seems like they've got a very well-funded campaign. They've got a lot of T-shirts. They had more posters up than the ANC. They had more posters up than the EFF, for that matter. In towns in the Western Cape, even, where you would think the MK doesn't even have a chance of getting a vote. So why would they waste resources by putting up posters to get people to vote for them in a town where they're not really going to get something? So that shows that they had money behind them. The reason why I think Mr. Steenhuisen of the Democratic Alliance said the Russia thing is because the former President Zuma of the MK party, he's got big ties to Russia. Of course, with the nuclear deal when he was president of the country that he wanted to do for a nuclear energy deal that he wanted to do for South Africa, that would have cost us like something like R1 trillion, and would have probably decimated our treasury. So that's why I think they made this claim. But I think it's a much more closer thing to home. I think it's people who got government contracts from the ANC under President Zuma's reign in dodgy ways. I think they were funding him in the hopes that he could take over, i.e. the province or the country again, and they could continue with their looting, continue with their government contracts that they get, but they don't deliver the services then, which is that just happens every day in South Africa. So I think I think it's much more closer to home than Russia. But who knows? I mean, the Russians might have a hand in it as well.
Yeah, and presumably they have to come up. Do they have to report to the electoral commissions to where they got their money from?
Yes, they do, Nicholas. But unfortunately, I think our electoral commission is a bit toothless in that aspect. They take Mr. Malema's party, the Economic Freedom Fighters, for example. They've hosted massive rallies, filling up stadiums with 90,000 people in this country, but they've barely declared, R1 million. So I don't know if the Electoral Commission's got the appetite or the ability to investigate if these parties are trying to hide funds.
Yeah, okay. Such a shame in a way, isn't it? Because the amazing thing is that despite all this chaos, despite the corruption, the huge number of scandals that there have been over the past decade or more, South African democracy still works. People go to the polls, the votes are counted, and you actually do get a relatively democratic vote. So it is, it is that is impressive. One needs to say it really. So Dawie, just tell us what's been happening then this week. So ostensibly a coalition between they've agreed a coalition, the ANC and the DA, but the nitty gritty hasn't been worked out, and they're talking about cabinet posts. What's happening?
Yes, so a document of intent was signed to form a government of national unity, bit of a throwback to the 1994 government of national unity between the ANC, the IFP, and I think National Party back then. So this document of intent, it states in one of the clauses that the president, whose prerogative it is to appoint his cabinet, needs to consult the broad proportionality of parties represented in our parliament when he will appoint his cabinet. But obviously, knowing politicians jockeying for position is always fun. And we've seen some lowballing from the ANC to the DA, telling the DA that, we can only give you 3 positions in our very bloated cabinet of 30 people, 30 ministries. And then the DA immediately say, well, that's just not going to work. We're the second biggest partner in this alliance now. We should at least have 10 based on a proportionality. But I think that's just the party's jockeying, Nicholas, to be honest. I understand that Mr. Steenhuisen and Mr. Ramaphosa met yesterday, and that meeting went quite well. And I think they will meet each other somewhere in the middle, giving the DA something like 7 or 8 positions. And I think the DA, even though they might have said now and made a big hullabaloo in the media of 10 positions, I think they'll be more than happy with 7 to 8 positions in the cabinet. And then also another big-ish partner in this government of national unity is the Inkatha Freedom Party, also a party whose support is basically all of it is based in KwaZulu-Natal. They're bigger than the ANC in KwaZulu-Natal at this moment. And I think they also would get something like 2 or 3 cabinet positions as well. And then there are some much more smaller parties. You're talking about people like 2% parties in the country, 1% parties, less than a percentage party in the countries who will be jockeying for deputy ministers' positions. And maybe some of them, if they have good standing with the ANC, can get a minister's position as well. But we expect an announcement sometime tomorrow.
I mean, for the ANC, this is really shocking because they've seen themselves as the party of government. They are used to running absolutely everything and running it really without much scrutiny. And so giving up some ministries to people must be, I mean, Ramaphosa's a pragmatic man. He's a guy who's ready to do these negotiations. He's ready to make compromises. But tell us a bit about the other parts of the party who might not be happy with that and why not?
Yeah, I always warn people that even though Mr. Ramaphosa is a very pragmatic leader, I don't think his party is very pragmatic at all. And I think that's why you also see this grandstanding of only wanting to give away 30 positions to the Democratic Alliance, because essentially what is being happened is it's a massive patronage that's being taken away from the ANC. Ministers are very, very well, they earn big money in South Africa. And essentially, you'll see, whereas, say 30 or 31 ANC members could be earning those big salaries, I mean, now it's going to be half of them, which I can't think is easy for anybody in that party to accept. So yeah, that is the thing that the ANC has to deal with now. But the other thing the ANC has to deal with now is that they will also have to negotiate on their policies, because this is now not just their government anymore. They can't just talk about stuff like nationalizing the Reserve Bank of South Africa, which would be a terrible idea. But they now need to discuss this with their new partners, i.e. the Democratic Alliance and also the Inkatha Freedom Party, who are both more of the freedom market orientated parties in their policies. So I think that's going to be very tough for them. And the other thing is, in our parliament, you need a 50% majority to pass new legislation. And in the past, that was basically just a rubber stamp for the ANC. They could decide what they wanted in policy conferences on their own, give it through to their members of parliament, who just pushed it through without any real debate in parliament, and the laws would have been signed by their president. That can't happen anymore. There needs to be negotiation, quid pro quo. Yeah, it's a different country altogether for the ANC.
It's amazing. It's such a sort of shift of things. In a moment, I'd love to get some thoughts from Peter Sullivan. For those who don't know, Peter was the editor of the Star newspaper back in the apartheid era, New Mandela, and then was the managing editor of the Independent newspaper group. And he's the expert on who leads our South African tours. And I think it's our most popular tour. So we'll come to Peter in just a second. But what I want to do is just take people through some of the sort of key indicators that show what a tough position South Africa is in. And I'm going to use a series of graphs from the Financial Times here. And I think Dawie, you can pick up on this. I mean, the key issue here is that whilst South Africa had the largest economy in Africa, recently beaten by Nigeria, and a significant number of key industries, we can think about mining, it has failed to grow. And it has failed to grow as its population has grown, and also at the same time has had a significant welfare distribution service, which has come in after apartheid. So its expenditure is high. So here's the really fascinating thing here. If you look at the top line here, this is South Africa, you can see that in terms of GDP, growth, it's stagnated really since 2005, actually dropped in the last sort of 9 years, and remains fairly stagnant.
Yeah,
Whereas,
the caveat, Nicholas, you can, if you go to 2005 or 2008, that's the year that former President Thabo Mbeki lost his position, and when former President Jacob Zuma basically took over government. So there you can see the fall starting.
Yeah, but the comparison is, if we look, there's Algeria again. Algeria's got all the minerals too. Egypt, I think Egypt's a pretty good. Egypt doesn't have the wealth that South Africa has, and yet it's growing consistently over this time period. So that's a pretty stark comparison. And then further down, as the economy's gone down, the rand has depreciated. And this is one key thing. You would think that would boost exports, which would be a boost for, in some way, would counterbalance that. Your currency devalues a bit, your exports become cheaper, and South Africa does have a major export base. But what's been the problem there?
Well, I think it's a policy of localization with our government, and our former Minister of Trade and Industry is Mr. Abraham Patel, and he was a member of the South African Communist Party, I kid you not, who doesn't ever actually stand in an election, but they are in alliance with the ANC, which means they are privy to cabinet positions and privy to implementing their policies as well in government, even though they're not an actual party anymore. And this basically this policy of localization would just try and make everything as cheap as possible here, but not by necessarily to export it, but by keeping it in the country. And that would come at the expense of importing cheaper stuff or better made stuff from other countries. Yeah, it's been terrible.
Well, last year we visited the port of Durban, which is run by Transnet, completely seized up over 3 months, I think, late last year, because the cranes can't work, and also the rail infrastructure doesn't work, so they can't shift stuff from the ports, which means that people who want to ship or import or export into that port can't do so. And that used to be one of the most important ports in Southern Africa. Pretty shocking. Against that, the key point is that you've got very, very high unemployment rates. And how sustainable is this, Dawie?
Well, if you're referring to the grants, I don't think it's sustainable at all, and I don't think there's budget for that in our treasury at the moment at all. But in spite of that, the African National Congress seems to hold on to this as some sort of massive achievement in them being able to provide all of these social grants for people that are unemployed. The unemployment figure rises every quarter. I think we're close to, I think the expanded unemployment rate in South Africa is more than 40%. So to then hold something like social grants, which the ANC actively campaigned upon in this past election, to hold that as some sort of win, I think it's counterproductive, but it's also just stupid and ludicrous. Especially you've got a treasury that needs to borrow every day. I think something like of every R1 that we earn in South Africa, you need to pay 30 cents of that back
But Dawie, surely if there are no jobs and people are incredibly poor, that's a key. It's a really important thing. If you're living in a township, you're living on.
Oh, no, of course, and
it's crucial.
And that's why the ANC would punt it, because they know people are poor and they know this is their only source of income that they get, and they try and that's why they started as an ANC policy. They also campaigned on fear, telling people that parties like the Democratic Alliance and then Carter Freedom Party would take away these grants, which was absolute lies. There was never any intention of them to take it away. I just think it's not workable in our current economic situation.
Okay, well, we'll put those charts to one side. I do want to bring in Peter here, since he's popped up, and we'll take advantage of him and get a few thoughts on the election, and then we'll come back to Dawie in a second and talk to both of you, in fact, about the challenges ahead. Peter, your thoughts? It was a very different election this time round, wasn't it?
Oh yeah, and it really is it's the new party on the block that changed everything. The DA came back with about the same amount of people, slight rise, but there was a rise in the population. But the DA, if the ANC dropped 17%, the DA should have at least picked up half of that, but they didn't. They seem to have hit that ceiling. And the amount of votes that MK got was just astonishing. Everybody was astonished, and it's very much the Zulu vote. It's the sort of identity politics to say, well, Cyril's not Zulu, and he's not doing stuff for us. People in KwaZulu-Natal are still very poor indeed. They've been very nasty to our father, which is Zuma, and they voted for them. And that threw everybody out. And of course, the ANC at the moment, I think, is kind of still reeling from the results. Helen Zille says that that Cyril thinks that although we're going to a government of national unity, he can just give a couple of seats or a couple of ministries to the DA and then carry on as before, to carry on and enjoy being in government. And I think she's going to be a bit of a shock for them, because I very much doubt that she will allow Cyril just to go his merry way. And she's been very smart in keeping Steenhuisen away from any of the negotiations until yesterday, when for the first time the principals met, which was Cyril and Steenhuisen, and apparently had a good meeting. But my money would be on Cyril in any meeting like that. So we'll wait tomorrow, as Dawie said, we'll see tomorrow how many people have got. It's very interesting for me in that in 1994, you had two parties. You had the National Party, which was a couple of goose steps shy of the Nazi Party in terms of how right-wing they were. And then you had the completely communist ANC, which was very close to Russia. And these two parties negotiated and ended up with a liberal democracy, which really was only the policy of the Progressive Party at that stage. And it looks like we're going to have the same thing now. You've got all the sort of Zulu acolytes and the heavy socialists joined with the Communist Party on one side. And then you've got a couple of right-wing parties on the other side, which are quite small. And you've got the DA as a sort of liberal democracy. And it looks like we're going to end up back there again.
Peter, I think it's ironic in a way that they owe it to Zuma for being in government, because had the MK not turned up, they might not have been in a position to have a coalition.
I'm not sure. I think if Zuma hadn't turned up, the IFP would have got a lot more votes, because I think people wouldn't have voted for the DA and they wouldn't have voted for the EFF because they simply don't like those two parties. But they do like the IFP because it's a Zulu party. And I think that's where people would have gone if that other party hadn't pitched up. And that wouldn't have been too bad for the DA, because the DA and the IFP are quite close in their policies.
Okay, so we looked at some of those economic indicators. I'd love both of you to give your thoughts on what the main challenges are ahead. And I think we've got to describe for people, we've talked about the economy overall, some of the things that ordinary South Africans face from day to day. And I'm thinking about, poor black South Africans in townships, the promises that were made to them at the end of apartheid, or people who've grown up since apartheid and haven't seen their living standards improve that much. So, but Dawie, what do you think of the main challenges, from in terms of government policy? What do they do now?
Well, I think this will also be one of the cabinet positions that are jockeyed for a lot. I know it's something that the Democratic Alliance would want as well, is transport in South Africa, especially when you look at passenger transport for trains in South Africa. It's basically been decimated. Under the previous Minister of Transport, they've tried and had an uptick. There are a few more passenger trains now going in Cape Town. But I mean, these lines were full of trains even 15 years ago in Cape Town, but nothing has been happening. It's because of agencies like PRASA, the South African Passenger Rail Agency, which was decimated during state capture by cronies being put in charge of these boards of these agencies, and then soliciting contracts from wherever, but then never using the money that they received to upgrade the system or to buy passenger trains that would fit on the rails, to give you a real world example. And now people need to make use of a taxi industry in a country where I would think a passenger rail agency or working passenger trains would make a massive difference for a person in a township to get to economic hubs and city centers. And now they have to take 4 or 5 taxis in the morning, wake up at 4 o'clock, get home at 8 o'clock in the evening. It's unworkable. So I would think that would be one of the first things that people would try and turn around in this.
I mean, surely these are really, my thought is, that how quickly can you turn some of these things around? And Peter, what are there any easy fixes? And we've seen the dreadful state of the roads, partly because the heavy transport's been moved from the railways onto the roads. We know last year alone, 280 days in which there were power cuts to the whole nation. And if you've got a business and you don't have routine power supplies, we know the capital's been fleeing South Africa, stock exchange down, all those key economic indicators down. So, Peter, are there any easy fixes? It would seem to me there's a long haul to go on this.
Yeah, I think Dawie's right. I mean, the transport is probably the easiest fix. I'm not quite as negative as you are. Jan Smuts always said that in South Africa, things never get as bad as you think they're going to get, but unfortunately, they never get as good as they could get. And I think that's exactly where we are at the moment. We've now had, I think, 90 days without any load shedding. So I think we will be over our load shedding by the end of this year. I'm not sure we'll have any at all this year, quite frankly. That's a really big tick upwards. I think what's really important for South Africans and people abroad to understand is that the levels of poverty in South Africa are very high. And it's difficult to define poverty, but one of the best definitions is to say the difference between people who are really poor in South Africa and people who are just making it is whether they can afford toilet paper or whether the girls can afford tampons or pads. Now, it doesn't happen in the Western world that people have to really worry about whether they can afford toilet paper. But in South Africa, that is the divide between luxury and non-luxury. So the real problem for any government is to get rid of that poverty. That's really where they should be focusing. And there are very wealthy people in the country. So to some extent, those wealthy people need to come forwards. And that's what they did sort of just before the election, when the really big businesses said, look, we can't take it anymore. And they got together with Cyril and they started fixing things. And I think as we saw at the port, the port is beginning to get much better. Cape Town doesn't seem to do anything, but Durban has certainly improved a huge amount from the beginning of the year. And I think with big business climbing in to do the other things, we'll start getting there. But the three big things are poverty, crime, and joblessness. Those are the three major things that need fixing, and none of those are quick fixes, Nicholas.
Yeah, no, okay, I see that. So, but Dawie, there's a risk here. I mean, not only okay, quick fixes to the economy on some things so you can deliver some change. But what's the political risk for the DA? We've already described the ANC as a sort of monolith that has a system of patronage. It's not easily going to give these ministries away. And I would think it's not going to allow policy to be implemented that easily. I think there's going to be a huge amount of obstruction. That's my bet. So how does the DA deal with that? And what's the risk to them? I thought we should. Well, I think it's worth talking about Helen Zille and Steenhuisen. These people are. Helen Zille, tough operator. I mean, she'll be pretty ruthless, but that's one woman. So tell us what you think the risks are and what they can achieve.
Well, I think some of the risk is that the DA do get hold of some key cabinet positions, but they don't have any meaningful power to effect change because of government policy. You wouldn't want a DA free market capitalist trying to implement ANC policy, which is much more socialist. But I think that's why, and this comes back to Mrs. Zille and her ruthlessness, is that one of the clauses in this document of intent for the Government of National Unity is that a policy discussion between all parties who have signed must happen after the cabinet has been established. This will hopefully happen, somewhere in July. But Steenhuisen told me that he thinks that will be where the real discussions on how government will look in the future happens, and where they will try and score some wins. So at least they've got the ANC committed to sit around the table to discuss policy. But I think the biggest fear is that, all of these government departments are full of ANC cronies who were deployed there by the ANC to implement ANC policies. And now you say you get the Minister of Police, which I think is a poison chalice for any party. If you go sit there and it stays in failure and crime still goes up because you don't get people who want to implement your policies, people who still think in ANC policy terms, I think it's impossible to effect any change there then. And I think that's a big risk for the DA is, say, if you are affected by crime tonight and you phone the police and the police doesn't pitch up, which happens every day in South Africa, you're not going to think, darn the ANC anymore. You're going to think darn the DA and the ANC. And I think that is the big risk for the DA, is that the bad stuff that are happening in government will also be put at their front door. Even if it is, it's stupid to think that a party can effect change within a month or two, but voters are very fickle in that regard.
So what's the time span? When would the next elections be scheduled?
Well, we've got a local government elections. That's for the municipalities who run our cities and our towns. That is scheduled for 2025. No, 2026, yeah. Thank you. And then the next the next general elections and provincial elections are in 5 years' time.
Yeah, so you essentially got 5 years in which to perform something. Peter, for those who don't know, tell us a bit about Helen Zille and what's her relation. She was she's the chair of the party. She was out of the party but she was certainly in the party, but she stood back for a while. I just want people to know a bit about her character and her relationship with the party.
Yeah, she kind of runs it. I mean, that's the truth of it. She. Maimane kicked her out of the party and said she wasn't allowed to take any part in it anymore. Musi Maimane, when he was the leader of the party, and she not so humbly accepted that. But then once she had managed to get him kicked out, Helen sort of took over again. She's not the leader of the party, but everybody knows she's the power and the throne, I would say. She's very formidable. You can't unmute my camera, can you?
Yeah, we should do. Hang on a second. Karen should be able to do it.
If you can, I'd really like to show you the front page of the Star today, because it's
right. I have to get Karen to do it, so but you keep talking.
I can do it,
there you go.
I'm going to promote him to panelist. So for about 30 seconds, we won't be able to hear him.
Okay, well, I'll ask Dawie a quick question, and we'll come back to you, Peter. We have to pull you away and put you back up again. So just give us 2 minutes. Dawie, very briefly, did you have a scoop from the last few days during the negotiations? Was there any story that sort of stuck out for you?
Yes, it was the first time that the DA asked the ANC for the deputy presidency, which I also think is a bit of a smokescreen from them. When they got offered the mere free cabinet positions, I think the DA went to go strong-arm the ANC and said, well, no. In other governments, you would see that the second biggest party is at least appointed as the deputy president, etc., etc. And they asked that position specifically for their leader, Mr. Steenhuisen. But I think that was a strong-arm tactic. The Steenhuisen, I know for a fact, has for a long time eyed the position of leader of government business, which is usually traditionally it goes to the deputy presidents in the country, but it doesn't need to go there. And I don't think Mr. Steenhuisen wants to be deputy president, but he wants to be leader of government business, which is a position where you basically manage the interaction between the cabinet and parliament and make sure that people in cabinet are in Parliament regularly, and also that Parliament executes the cabinet's policy positions.
So a much more effective position.
Yes, exactly. The deputy presidency is basically ceremonial.
Yeah.
I don't know if you can. Can you see this?
Yeah.
A rather formidable Zille.
Yes.
It kind of says she's got Luthuli House by the. She's got a grip on them, and it really is quite a good picture of Helen at her best or her worst. I'm not quite sure what. I thought you would quite like to see that. One of the things that Helen did, so in these negotiations, the very first letter of intent, the DA said there has to be a 60% majority for anything to be passed by the cabinet. And Ramaphosa accepted it or signed, but it just crossed out the 60 and wrote 50, which was on Friday. And Helen sent it back and said, we will not accept this. In that case, we're out of the government of national unity. Now, she's a very tough character. She's very much a kind of iron lady, and I think she's very much like Thatcher was, except her policies are not quite what Thatcher's were. She will continue to be strong, I think, during this time, during the negotiations. She's the one who negotiated Cape Town's mayor to become Cape Town's mayor when she was in a minority party, but she got 8 different parties together, eventually 11 parties, to make her the mayor. And from then she went to become the premier of the Western Cape. And the thing about the DA is that unlike the other parties, it has some experience in governing. Right? The rest of the parties don't. It's only the ANC really and the DA. The IFP governed for a very short time after 1994. But they don't have anybody in the IFP who has any experience in government. The DA have several premiers of the Western Cape, and that will help them in their negotiations.
Dawie, can you just describe how Cyril Ramaphosa has run government? I mean, so Zuma left office in 2018, and the great hope was that the Ramaphosa, because he had an industry background, would be able to make government work and deliver change in some of these areas that we've been talking about. But that didn't happen. Why not? Why do we think that he's been so weak?
I think for his first term, especially, he was hamstrung by factional fights within his own party, and he was trying to conquer his party before he tried to set government on the right track. And unfortunately, also for him, COVID-19 happened in 2020, which is like the second year of his term, which I think decimated, the reserves that the country had. So yeah, his first term was on beating his political enemies within his own party. And trying to win that battle so that he could stay ANC president, to be elected as president of the country again, which means that some of his more key governmental drives have been put on the back burner. Whether that is due to his ineptitude as a leader or the ineptitude of his party members in government, I'm not sure. But I think it's a bit of both.
Yeah.
So yeah, he's been stuck on that for most of his tenure so far.
Peter, what do you think? Do you think he's going to be able to use the DA? I mean, would he see this as an advantage within his own party? I wonder what his view is.
Yeah, I fear that you kind of hope he's now going to get freed up because he doesn't really have to worry about being re-elected because he can't be. And it will free him up to do what he wants. But I'm afraid, I agree with Dawie, what he wants is to unite the ANC. And it's a hopeless case. It's a natural thing to want. You don't want to be seen as the guy who split the party. And that's not the legacy that he wants, this party that's 100 years old. He wants to be seen as the man who held it together, which he did to some extent, except now with MK, clearly it hasn't been held together. And the EFF and MK together, they really constitute little bits of the ANC that's broken off. And I think we are moving towards a divide in the country where you have people who are very strongly communist, socialist, identity politics, and people who are liberal, more conservative. And I'm not quite sure who's got the numbers on their side. If we had another election tomorrow, I think it would be quite a close call, frankly.
I mean, that for me is fascinating because, that clash of ideologies hasn't had to happen because the ANC have just sort of sat there in government and really haven't had to do anything because their power has been so overwhelming. I guess the worry is that the EFF and the MK are going to become stronger and that the next coalition government might be very, very different indeed. I mean, both your thoughts on that, starting with you, Dawie.
I do fear for MK in the fact that I think they are based on President Zuma's personality and kind of a Zulu tribalism. And he's already an old man. He's 82. He's been sick for a while as well. If he passes away, I don't know what's left of MK. And I don't know if MK has really got any structural legs to continue as a party. They might try and form it now. But I think they really hope that they would be in government so they get some form of income, be it through patronage or corruption, but just so that they could get on their legs. But I don't see that happening now that they're not in government anyway. And it's been really a mess of them trying to communicate their policies or even just their decisions on whether to attend the opening of Parliament. It's kind of like they have to wait for the smoke to come out of Nkandla, that's former President Zuma's homestead in KwaZulu-Natal, before they make a decision. So yeah, I haven't got much hope for them. And as for the EFF, they are also made out of their leader, Mr. Julius Malema. And yeah, it'll be interesting to see how he navigates the new system and his position in it. I think he kind of wants to position himself now as the official opposition, the more centralist official opposition, and not the crazies as they are known in Parliament at the moment. give that to...
That's incredible. So I can't get my head around that. Julius Malema being seen as a centrist and not a crazy. Peter, what's your? I mean, I'm trying to sort of think about worst case scenarios. You know, that you could get a very different kind of coalition if this doesn't work out.
Yeah, I think, you know, you look at the EFF and the MK and you say, you add their numbers and you think, oh, well, it's not so frightening. But added to that number must be the people in the ANC who are extremely unhappy with this coalition with the DA. The ANC itself contains socialists and communists. It is a tripartite alliance of communists. I mean, they're one of the 3 members of the tripartite alliance. And inside the ANC, those communists are a lot more aligned towards MK's policies and the EFS policies. I mean, there are some smart people among the communists. They're not all complete idiots. And they have a different view of where the economy should be going and how it should be split. They kind of tend to have the same view of the very rich, but that's about it. And I think that's the kind of split that will happen. It's quite a big rump of the ANC will go towards the MK side, let's call it, towards identity politics, towards saying, not that we must get rid of the constitution, but that we should be more socialist and not as pro-business as we are at the moment. Because quite frankly, the Ramaphosa government is quite pro-business. The only problem is that one of the biggest businesses is stealing money, and they happen to be very good at it. So, you know, while they're pro-business, the tenders they're only worth 75% of what they should be worth, because 25% goes to some individual, which then goes, who knows, to Switzerland in a bank account.
Yeah, I do want to share. I'd love a few more questions. If we don't have more questions, we're going to have to wrap up shortly. I want to show one more thing, which is not this graph here, that we were talking about unemployment and social grants, but the inequality in South Africa. I mean, this really for me is startling. This is the Gini index. The Gini coefficient is a measure of how equal or unequal your society is, and there is South Africa as the most, in terms of the G20, developing economy. We're not talking about the very poorest economy in the world. We're talking about a country that's got major mineral resources, a significant industrial base, and there's the inequality there. And this is something that really has not shifted significantly since the end of apartheid. So that really that's a shocking legacy for the ANC. And it's as all these graphs have made up, it's the lack of growth over the last decade that has really fueled that. Peter, your thoughts on that? I mean, some people take it for granted that it's been there for so long, and that's just one of those aspects of South African life.
No, I think the reality is we do, I hate to say it, we do need more socialism. We need, to some extent, we need to be taxing the very rich. We need to be taking money away from people who have too much of it, and there are a lot of them. And what too much of it, of course, is a very scary definition always. And I think it's got to be fairly radical in what we do in order to get rid of that poverty. I mean, that Gini coefficient is a disgusting thing for South Africa to have. And it doesn't have to be there. It is possible for us to have policies that would change that. But there would be a major shift towards socialism. And I'm not sure that most South Africans can stomach it. Most white South Africans could stomach it. Or the people in the DA, for instance, would find it very difficult.
Or have faith that it would be implemented properly.
That you can deal with it.
Or have faith that it would be implemented properly, because when you have a government that's so incredibly corrupt and unable to deliver services, you think, well, socialism to what effect?
Yeah, but Nicholas, what's the alternative? The alternative is to sort of wring your hands and say it's terrible and there's nothing we can do about it. But you ask me, what is the solution? I really don't know. There's clearly no easy solution. But you've got to bring that Gini coefficient down, and you've got to try and aim towards Denmark, if you like, and say, how do we get to be more equal with everybody? And I don't think grants is the way to do it. Clearly, the most pressing thing, but it's a pressing thing for even the developed countries, is providing jobs. I mean, even in America, that's the real, everybody keeps looking at how many jobs there are. So it's not like good old days where there were tons of jobs and not enough people to do them. There are now too many people on the planet and not enough jobs for them.
Well, we'll take one question from Sarah Biffin in just a second. Disclosure, that's my mother. who's watching and also travels to South Africa significantly, or quite a lot. So I'll take a question from her in just a second. But Dawie, I mean, your thoughts on that? I suspect you're slightly more to the right. You're more liberal in your view of market economics, and many of your readers or Afrikaans readers would not be encouraged by the idea of increased taxes and greater state spending.
No, they would definitely not be encouraged by more taxation. But I do think Peter is right. It comes down to jobs. And unfortunately, I don't think with the economy as it is at the moment, there isn't a space to create more jobs. So how else are you going to eradicate that unequalness? And then, I don't have the answers. I'm happy that I'm not in government. I just need to write about it. Thank goodness. But yeah, I don't even think the Democratic Alliance has got the complete answer to it. Hopefully. Was it Ian Hislop of The Spectator in the UK who said he hopes that coalitions can rule out the crazies and the loonies? Well, I hope that this coalition can rule out the crazies and the loonies, and that the battle of ideas are won by the smart people at the table. But unfortunately, in South Africa, I doubt it.
In terms of Dawie, even yours is on the line, isn't it? I mean, your newspaper's about.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay, question from Sarah Biffin. Just need to open your microphone. There you go.
Can I ask two questions, please?
Go on.
The first one is, how long do you think this coalition has a chance of lasting? I mean, up to the next election or for a shorter period? And the second one is on Eskom, the electricity company. Surely a lot of businesses and private people have made their own provisions. So that might be the reason for the improved position.
Yeah, Peter, we were talking about this earlier. I made a bet, and I fear I'm going to lose, which is that there would be, I think it was the summer of 2025, if there were still power cuts then, there's a certain economist working for a bank in South Africa who I might own a large case of wine to. But go on, you answer my mother's question.
Yeah, Sarah, if I may call you that, the answer to all of your questions is yes. The reason that we don't have power cuts anymore is because there's a lot of private solar being put in. We're putting in our little modest block of apartments. We're putting it in ourselves. I'm busy looking at it. And most people I know have now put it in. So that's the reason. And also Eskom is being fixed. So there are two things happening there. And then how long is it likely to last? Both answers are right. It may not last very long, and it may last the full 5 years. Nobody really knows. And you said, how long could it last? Well, clearly it could last for 5 years. I don't think anybody's looking beyond the 5 years to see what happens in 2029. As to how we're going to vote then, I think that would be looking a little bit deep into the crystal ball. But this current bunch, I think they've got a good chance of lasting the 5 years. You know, one of Helen's problems is that they don't have much leverage. The only leverage they really have is to abandon their government of national unity. And you can't really play that card more than once. And once you play it, it's played. So I think they'll last the 5 years, frankly.
And if I could add quickly there, I mean, the DA really campaigned hard on preventing this so-called doomsday coalition between the ANC, the EFF, and MK. So I do think there's a lot in it for the DA, seeing that they did not grow a lot during this election, to make this government work, because this is the one thing they promised, is that they will prevent the doomsday. So they need to make this thing work. Otherwise, their current leadership, I think, is in a bit more of a precarious position than they would want to admit.
But let's just say that the economy does pick up and people are happier. There's no suggestion that the DA are going to be the beneficiaries from that, are they, Dawie?
No, not necessarily. Not necessarily. And I think that'll be interesting to see how that plays out in the coming years. I do think, though, what has suited the DA well is that some of the other more right-leaning parties and parties who share policies of them, such as the Freedom Front Plus and Inkatha Freedom Party are also in this government. So I can't see they can't stand outside and point fingers if it fails. And the DA also can't stand outside and like excuse themselves from the government if it fails. They're all in this together. They need to make this work together.
Well, let's just get on, Peter. Go on.
One big plus for the DA is that the ANC's campaigning over the last 30 years has been to say the DA are like Satan and they want to bring back apartheid and they're a disgusting bunch of people and they're only white and all they're interested in white stuff. Now suddenly they have to change their minds. And that's actually, the DA is not that bad, you know. They do believe in market stuff like we do. They do believe in the Constitution. They're not all white, actually. We've noticed there's an odd black person among them. And we were actually lying to you when we said they want to bring apartheid back, because they definitely don't want to bring apartheid back. They are a party that arose to fight apartheid. I mean, it's not a party that arose to promote apartheid. And suddenly the ANC have to give that story. They have to change their story of 30 years. And they're going to be changing that story to the very rural people who just sat and believed them and said, oh, yes, oh, yes, oh, yes, oh, the DA is terrible, never vote for them, that's Satan, they want to bring back apartheid. Suddenly those same people are going to be saying, oh, actually the DA is not so bad, right? So when the next election comes, the ANC is not going to be able to go back to the electorate and say, the DA are the people who want to bring apartheid back. Because by then it's going to be pretty obvious they're not. Right. Yeah. And they're going to have said that themselves.
Listen, I think we have to wrap it up there. Really, really interesting discussion. My thanks to Peter for joining in, which is an added bonus. My thanks to Dawie as well. What's going to happen to you, Dawie? What's happening to just tell us briefly what's happening to your newspaper or to your news outlet?
Yeah, they're closing down a bunch of the Afrikaans newspapers, but Rapport will still live online, not just unfortunately not in paper format anymore, which is quite sad because I do think on print we look quite good, but we will still be available online on Netwerk 24.
Okay, well, I hope we can get the opportunity to meet you when we're next do our tour, and we're doing our schedules for next year's tour, and I'm hoping we can get South Africa in towards the end of that year. Peter, you were going to say something.
His newspaper used to be the biggest Afrikaans Sunday newspaper in the world.
I think it still is, Peter. I think it still is.
It still is, yeah. Nicholas, I'm just a bit worried. I mean, you're in Wales, aren't you?
Yeah, we are. Well, on the border.
You haven't asked about the rugby.
What rugby? What's that?
Just wanted to make a point.
Very interested in football now. Okay. Thank you both very much indeed for your time. Really, really good discussion. I do recommend people, if they want to have a look at the FT's article there, it's easy to look up. We'll be scheduling our tour to South Africa, which, as I say, is really one of my favourites, and really our customers' a consistent favourite. So we're looking forward to going back again. Thanks again very much indeed to Peter and to Dawie Boonzaaier for their time.